So, what is Microsoft Active Directory? So, so the exam has a strong emphasis on the Microsoft Active Directory and AWS Directory services. So, I really want to make sure that we both understand what this is, because I think it's quite complicated, especially if you are not from the Microsoft background. And I want to make sure that you choose the right answer at the exam when a question or two comes up on this topic. So, what is the Microsoft AD? So it's found on any Windows server that has something called AD domain system, and it's going to be a database of objects. Would be user accounts, computers, printers, file shares, security groups, and it's gonna be centralized way for security management, creating new accounts, assigning partitions, all in your Windows in Microsoft environment. Okay, so and the objects, the users, the accounts, the printers, everything, they are going to be grouped together and organized into something called a tree. And as the name indicates, chuckles, a group of tree is called the forest. So what do we have? Microsoft AD. So what do we have Microsoft AD here? For example, we have a domain controller that knows that John is username and the password is the password, which is not a very strong password, sure. But anyway, and we have other Microsoft machines connected to this domain controller. The beautiful thing is that now one can use John password of any of these machines to connect an Active Directory will check the login itself. So that allows us to synchronize sort of all login across domain controller. That is something very simplified, as simple simplified as well. But don't get me like if don't do this exactly perfectly for the Microsoft AD, but this is at high level, providing you an idea of how Microsoft AD works. So what is ADFS? Well, ADFS will provide single sign-on access applications, and it has several innovations across third party. For example, the console, the console, the console, Dropbox, Office 365, and so on. So we have seen how ADFS works. So remember, the user will browse the URL in the Microsoft Active Directory service, which will authenticate the user, and against a Microsoft Active Directory, the SAML token will be returned, and and then we'll exchange it with the AWS to get a sign-in URL for the console. So we'll see how this will be improved with the SSO single sign-on service later on. Okay, so now we have so now let's get into AWS directory services. We have three flavors of AWS directory services managed service by AWS. So the first one is called AWS Managed Microsoft AD. As you can expect, is going to be a Microsoft AD in the cloud. So you are going to be able to create your own AD in AWS managed users locally, and it has support for MFA. You will have to establish a trust with your own premise AD, and we'll see what that trust look like. Okay, so if you want to have some kind of connection between your on-premise AD and your AWS managed Microsoft AD, so let's have a look here in the diagram. You can see that the managed AD is connected to the on-premise AD through a trust, and it supports MFA, and so the users can authenticate on the right hand side or on the left hand side. Then we have the Microsoft AD. We have database directory, database directory AD connector. So I guess they name things differently, but anyway, so this is a proxy to make the link from your cloud AD to your on-premises AD, and it supports MFA. So and the users are for the only managed in one place, which is the on-premise AD. So in this case, the authentication goes to the AD connector, which is a proxy, and it gets proxy back onto the on-premise AD to get the response. So in the first case, with Microsoft Managed AD, we have to place where the users were defined. They were defined on premises and in the cloud, and there was some trust between the two. But with the AD connector, they are only defined on-premise, and we have defined proxy to access that on-premise AD directly from the cloud. Finally, we have simple AD, which is not Microsoft AD. It's a AD compatible API. It's called Samba. And it's managed in AWS, but it's standalone and it cannot be joined with an on-premise AD. So in this case, with simple AD, it's a cheaper alternative. It doesn't have much capability. It doesn't support MFA, for example. It cannot be joined to AWS such as SQL Server and so on, but contributes simpler, cheaper, and maybe a good solution based on the questions you get. So we have three kinds of directory services, and I think they are quite clear, the differences, but I really want to go deep dive into each of those to make it very, very clear as to how they are different. So with AWS Managed Microsoft AD, you are going to be deploying Microsoft Active Directory within your own VPC. So here, this is what it look like. I have the diagram. So this VPC actually here, both of the availability zone are in the same VPC. The diagram has got a little manipulated or somewhat misplaced. Okay, so here's what it looks like. We have two AZs and we'll have two AD domain controller or ADDC deployed in two different zones. Applied in two different AZ for high availability, and now we are going to be able to create easy to Windows instance, and we can deploy traditional applications on these instances. For example, SharePoint. For example, we would be able to deploy the SharePoint, and then we have or you can do something like called seamless domain join from your Amazon EC2 instances in multiple accounts and VPC directly onto your domain controllers. So this is a feature directly coming out of the managed Microsoft AD, and finally we have integration. So if we deploy a managed Microsoft AD in the cloud, we can use it seamlessly. Integrated with RDS for SQL Server, workspaces, quick sites, and we can even create SSO, single sign-on, to provide access to third-party applications, and have another program showing you this in a second. So this directory, the managed Microsoft AD can be a standalone repository in AWS, and or it can be joined to your on-premise AD, and we'll see how to join it in a second. The multi-AZ deployment is going to be 2 AZ at minimum, but in case you want to increase your scaling and your availability, you are able to add more domain controllers. So in this example, I am adding 2 more domain controllers, and that's 4 ADDC. 4 ADDC. Might be some of the domain controller will be kind of hidden by just my face and body. So you just consider, so you might be able to see them now. For ADDC, you will actually see the the slides at this point whenever actually it's being hidden from my body and the view. Okay, for ADDC, and we have increased availability. So finally, this looks like RDS for Microsoft AD. So you have automated backups if you need to, and another last feature is that you get automated multi-region replication of your directory if you need to. So now let's have a look at integrations in depth. So your managed Microsoft ADC is in the middle. ADDC is in the middle, and it can get integrated with or your with your on-premise Active Directory using something like called two-way forest trust, and we'll see in this in a second in the next slide. It can also integrate with a bunch of database services. So most importantly is RDS for SQL Server, Amazon Workspaces, QuickSight, Amazon QuickSight, Connect Work Docs. Then we have the single sign-on SSO, and with single sign-on on that, we'll see in the future lecture we have access to like more standard business applications such as like the GitHub, Box, Dropbox, Office 365, and G Suite, and so on. Finally, your traditional Active Directory applications such as your .NET applications, your SharePoint, and your SQL Server that you deploy on EC2 instances uh, can obviously be integrated with like the Active Directory that's managed by AWS. So what do you remember out of it? So what do you remember out, like that is going to be the most integrated with AWS from directory services. So now something here need to be highlighted is to how to connect this to your on-premise Active Directory, because that is going to be extremely important and going to be extremely important for exam to understand this subtle important thing. So you are able to connect your on-premise AD to AWS managed Microsoft AD, and for this you need to set up a direct connect, and this will be going to be the DX in this course, or a VPN connection between the two. So we have your on-premise and your VPC, and we have set up connection between these two, and so we have our on-premise Microsoft AD, and which manages its own user on-premise, and you have AWS managed Microsoft AD. This is going to be also be managing its own users on AWS, and so you can set up three kind of forest trust. The first one is one way, when we have AWS trust on premise, and the second one is the other one way, which you have the on premise trust AWS, and finally you have something called two-way forest trust, where they both trust each other, and means so that you can access one from the other and vice versa. So let's have a look. We have trust this way and trust that way. So that means that we have a two-way forest trust. And the important thing to understand here is that this forest trust is going to be different than synchronization. So replication is not something that is supported by AWS management Microsoft AD. So that means that it's supported by AWS managed Microsoft AD. So their users are living independently on two different Microsoft Active Directory. But thanks to like this forest trust, they are able to talk to each other in case one user is missing from one and ask the other direct connect. So here, do you think so? Like some like the questions being asked like to from the user, like here, do you think you have the user because I trust you? So very important to understand this distinction. So your traditional Active Directory app can connect to on-premise. Your EC2 instances can do seamlessly domain join onto your Microsoft managed AD. But now because we have set up a two-way forest trust, your traditional Active Directory app, in case it is trying to request a domain that belongs to AWS, thanks to the trust, it's able to get all the way and check the user on the right hand side. So this is the whole idea behind two-way trust. You don't need to know that level of detail in the exam, but hopefully that gives you a much better idea of what is the trust between your on-premise and your online on AWS Microsoft AD. So now let's talk a bit more on the solution architecture, because we have to get into those and they can be quite complicated. But say you want to have your Microsoft AD that's on-premise replicated on AWS for minimizing latency. So for example, we want to say, okay, we want to have our replica of the on-premise AD on AWS, because if somehow the direct connect or the VPN goes down, then we still want our users to have connectivity and function correctly. So we also need to be establishing trust between these ADs. So what does it look like? Well, we have our on-premise Microsoft AD, and with one domain, and we have the VPC AWS Managed Microsoft AD DC with another domain. The only way here to set up some kind of replication is for you to deploy Active Directory on an easy two Windows instance, and you will have to set up replication. And by setting up those replication, we'll have a replica on-premise uh, Microsoft AD and our VPC, which may help minimize latency and also have a disaster recovery strategy. And finally, we can set up a two-way forest trust between our EC2 instances and our AWS Managed Microsoft ADDC in this own VPC. So this is a kind of solution architecture that will be asked from you at the exam. So that's why it's really important to get the basics done first and then talk about like these little interesting twists on solution architecture. Okay, so that's all for the AWS Managed Microsoft AD. Now we have AD connector, so which is much simpler. So it's going to be like a gateway, so a proxy to redirect your request to your on-premise Microsoft Active Directory. There's no caching capability, so the users are solely managed on-premise. There is no trust being set up and need to have VPN or direct connect. So it doesn't have this integration with SQL Server. It doesn't do seamless joining. It comes share directory. So this is something a bit more basic, and hopefully the example will be very clear if you need AD connector. That's some kind of directory proxy, but AD connector in case the connection goes down, well, it's basically useless. Okay, so how does that work then? So well, we have our corporate office and the database cloud, and there will be a VPN or direct connection between these two, and then therefore we can have our Active Directory within our corporate office. But our users who wants to again will have to do the following flow. So first they will use the credential onto a custom signing page. This signing page will be connected to the AD connector, which may be multi-AZ. So in one AZ, the connector will be used. This AD connector then will proxy the request all the way through the Active Directory on the corporate office and will perform LDAP authentication. Okay. And if this is good, then the AD connector will perform the STS assume role IAM, which will get back temporary credentials, and then our users will be authenticated into AWS. Finally, we have simple AD, which is going to be very inexpensive Active Directory, and it's going to have the most common directory features. It will support joining of EC2 instances, managing users and groups, but it won't support multi-factor authentication. It will not support the integration with RDS SQL Server. It will not support SSO, single sign-on, and it's only for a small amount of users. So like the 500 users up to maybe 5,000 users, depending on the tier you want to use. So it's powered by Samba 4 and it's compatible with Microsoft AD in terms of the API, but it's a lower cost, lower scale. It's only has basic AD capability or LDAP compatibility, and you cannot set up a trust with on-premise Microsoft AD. So that's it. Obviously, the most important one is going to be the first one described, but now you have three options of directory services, and hopefully there's a bit more clear which one to choose based on which circumstances at the exam you are in. Alright, that's it. I will see you in the next lecture.